Live from Washington, I'm Aisha Tanzim and you're watching Access Point. American Secretary of State's intense shuttle diplomacy has brought both Israelis and the Palestinians to the table again, with commitment this time, though, to stay there for at least 9 months. Today, we'll focus on what could be done differently to achieve results and get beyond the past stalemates. Joining us in studio to talk about this issue is Dr. Emanuele Ottolenghi. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And from our London studios, we'll have Nadeem Shahadi, an associate fellow of Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program. Welcome to Access Point. But before I start the discussion with you, I want to find out how much attention people are paying to this issue in our region and around the world. And for that, let's go to Sarah Zaman, who's standing by on our social media desk. Sarah, what are you hearing?
Aisha, when we ask commenters on our social media platforms whether they're following the recent developments in the Middle East peace process or not, many people said no. Now, some are not following these because the issue is either not high on their list of news topics to follow or they don't trust the media coverage. But the most common reason for not following the talks is a sense of disillusionment and a lack of trust in the parties involved. On Facebook, Irfan Wahid Khokar says, I'm not following the developments because Israel has America's support. How can this dialogue generate any results if America is leading it? This is the most common response we got. Pakistani commenters simply don't trust American leadership on this issue. Manzar Chaudhry says, I am not following this dialogue because this is a joke. Israel needs to give up occupied territories. It can't be an occupier and have a dialogue at the same time. But some people are a little optimistic. Fazlullah hopes this dialogue will indeed be fruitful because America wants peace between Israel and Palestine, he says. And peace in the Middle East, he thinks, is in the best interest of the world at large. May God bless these talks. And we also spoke to a few people on the streets in Pakistan. Let's hear what they had to say about this.
I don't think so that they are going in a positive direction, though. Actually, they have their own agenda and motives, so they are exploring about that.
तो ये बस उनके एक जो ना शो ऑफ करने के लिए विजिट्स होते हैं कि हम जो है ना वो मुस्लिम दुनिया को शो करने के लिए कि हम जो है ना ये आपकी बेहतरी के लिए फ़लस्तीन की बेहतरी के लिए भलाई के लिए हम जो है ना काम करना चाह रहे हैं.
So again, just a sense of disillusionment. People think that this is just to put up a show in front of the Muslim world, that America is working for its betterment. Send us your comments and read what others are saying at facebook.com/accesspointwithat or join the community on VOA Urdu's Facebook page. For now, back to Aisha and our guests.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Let's start the discussions from where our commenters left it off. First of all, has this issue lost its luster in the Middle East? It used to be the issue, and now you have Syria and Egypt and Libya and all those other, Iran, all those other things going on. Do you think it's lost the focus?
Well, if you look at the Middle East today, you kind of get a sense that there is pandemonium going on all over the place. And there is certainly a situation where the United States, which is still the superpower, has blundered on a number of issues, is not capable of formulating a coherent policy on the burning issues of the day in the region. Syria is one great example, Egypt to a certain extent also. Why bother with an issue that has been stalemated for so long, doesn't seem to have better conditions than the last time it was tried? And on the other hand, an issue that is not really causing as much upheaval and turmoil as everything else around it.
Okay, you say why bother? We'll definitely come to that. Why bother and what could be done differently this time? This issue comes up every time the Middle East peace talks or anything else. The issue comes up, is America a neutral arbiter? People around the globe don't really think so. Even Israelis and Palestinians don't think so. Why is then America always called upon to be the arbiter?
Because America can deliver the kind of guarantees to both sides and has the kind of leverage that can bring around...
Leverage with Israel,
certainly has leverage with Israel, but also in the Arab world, America has leverage. It can provide guarantees. It can provide financial wherewithal to uphold the kind of arrangements that are needed if a peace process is to come to successful fruition. So America is still the only game in town. There are other powers in the world who have tried in various ways to intervene, to interfere, to contribute. But at the end of the day, even when you look at America from the point of view of certain Arab players with mistrust or with a sense of disappointment for America's positions, everybody comes back to Washington to ask for help. So the Americans are still the ones who can deliver.
As we've been told, America may not be a neutral arbiter, but it's an effective arbiter because, as you said, it can deliver. What's happening with the quartet this time around? We don't hear their name anywhere.
Well, you know, Tony Blair has been tweeting about this issue, and there's certainly a flurry of diplomatic activity going on, and there are talks. But in the end, what matters is what Washington will deliver or not. And what matters are the direct talks that the Americans were able to put together once again after a nearly 3-year stalemate. So
on 30th of July, the first round of talks here in Washington. August 14, it'll resume in Jerusalem
and then Jericho.
And then Jericho. And I was very intrigued by the figure of 9 months thrown out there. Why exactly 9 months? Unless they're going to deliver a baby, but.
Listen, what we call the peace process is a diplomatic string of meetings, dialogue, negotiations that has been going on for 20 years, just about, you know, or even a little more if you start the count by the Madrid conference in 1991. The two sides have met countless times. The issues have been eviscerated down to the smallest detail countless times at the highest levels. It's not like this is a file that it is unknown or that the positions of the two sides are unknown. Certainly the circumstances have changed a little bit. The kind of security concerns and issues and dilemmas that both sides face with regard to the region and each other have slightly changed. But bottom line, things are very well known. So if you want to solve it, it shouldn't take years.
It should take less than a year. Let's quickly go to London. Mr. Nadeem Shahadi has joined us. Mr. Shahadi, welcome to Access Point.
Hello, good evening.
Let me ask you this. Why would anyone think that this time around would be different? Because it very much looks like the rerun of an old movie.
Yes, but I think that the irrelevance of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that Emanuele has talked about is in fact an asset rather than a liability. It's not such a hot potato as it used to be, especially on the regional level. Everybody's busy with other things. The main thing also is that you have a almost total change in regional leadership. And these were spoilers. These were the Assads, the Qaddafis, the Mubaraks, the Ben Alis, and all these leaders of the region
But was
legitimized.
Mubarak a spoiler? Let me ask you, was Mubarak really a spoiler, or was Mubarak who was holding, when Muslim Brotherhood came, one of the biggest concerns was that they weren't going to hold up the deals made with Israel?
And one of the biggest surprises was that they didn't. Because Mubarak used to use it as a point of extortion. He used to say, if it's either me or the Muslim Brotherhood, and the first thing they'll do is they will cancel the peace deal with Israel, the Camp David Accord, and that's what kept him in power. So all these despots in the region,
the new players on the ground. Let me come back to you.
The old players legitimized themselves by manipulating the Arab-Israeli conflict, and they're no longer there.
Let me quickly come to you with this point. Do you think it's changed enough on the ground that there are new players that it may actually significantly impact the talks?
Well, the problem is that none of the players who were there before, who had, they had their motives and they had their, their differences, but they had control. And today it's very hard to see that those players in the region who could make a difference have control of their own constituencies and their own countries, and are actually seized upon this issue. I mean, it's true that the Muslim Brotherhood, in its short stint in power, did not revoke the peace treaty. It even actually tried to manage, the situation in the Sinai Peninsula and in the Gaza Strip in a way that was, not undermining the overall goal of keeping things quiet. The problem is that the Egyptian government, this Egyptian government, and whatever comes next, will have to face, the threat of collapse of the Egyptian economy, and the whole situation domestically, and frankly, to be
half
able,
the country's out on streets, as we know.
correct, and so to be able to actually play a constructive role is very difficult, regardless of your intentions at this time.
Mr. Shahadi, not just the Egyptian government. If peace is to happen in the Middle East, all players need to be on the table, and we see players on the table that may or may not have control. We don't even see the whole of the Palestinian side there, honestly.
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, the best way to describe it is that both sides have more serious internal problems within their own constituency than with each other. The Israelis have very serious internal problems, and the Palestinians have very serious internal problems. And they also have totally different perspectives, because I think that the polls show that in Israel, the issue is not as relevant. If it fails, they'll just shrug their shoulders and it won't make a big difference.
They're
to
used to
their
living
lives.
under the
Whereas
status quo. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and the status quo is interpreted as favorable to them. They can carry on without a solution. Whereas on the Palestinian side, it's a totally different story. So there are these differences. There are lots of complexities, but I think the internal complexities, are as much a hurdle as the bilateral.
Let me quickly come to you with this idea that Israelis are more willing to live under the status quo. Do you think that's true, or do you think the Israeli government has been feeling the pressure of isolation, and some look at their decision to go back to EU and complain about the decision of sanctions over the companies that go beyond the 1967 borders and try to negotiate? So it's not the Israel fire blazing that we've known from the past.
I don't think that the Israelis are happy with the status quo. They're more resigned to it when they look at the experience of the last 13 years. I mean, let's face it, this U.S. administration has tried twice and failed to jumpstart the talks. Now they're in their third effort. We wish them well. But it is not like it is such a promising scenario. And I think that the Israelis, just like the Palestinians, will accede to an agreement and sign up to an agreement if it meets what they define as their own national interests. If that doesn't happen, the status quo is preferable, especially at a time when you look at the whole regional scenario and what you see is chaos and uncertainty on all borders. I don't think that the Israelis look at their own situation and see such severe internal problems. They have problems at the border. Their biggest problem right now is to find a suitable successor to the resigning governor of the Bank of Israel, which is a problem. But I think that it is of a wholly different scale than the problems you see, say, in Syria, in Egypt, or indeed in Lebanon.
And that is also another thing. I will come back to what's happening inside Israel and how many people are with Bibi on this peace talk. But one of the interesting questions was that everybody talks about two-state solution, and I wanted to find out how many people on the ground, and particularly in our region, thought the two-state solution was the best solution. So let's quickly take a detour to our social media desk and to Sarah Zaman. Sarah, over to you.
Aisha, commenters have mixed views on whether the two-state solution is the right path to peace. Most commenters agree with Mohammed Ajmal Khokar, who on our Facebook page says, how can you have two separate states? Present-day Israel has been created on Arab lands. There is no reason for creating Israel in the Middle East. But there is definitely support for the two-state solution as well on our social media platforms, albeit for different reasons. Sanaullah Khan thinks under the present circumstances, the only realistic and pragmatic solution is two separate independent states of Palestine and Israel. He says Arabs have failed to dislodge Israelis from their lands. Now Arabs and Muslims are so weak, they cannot enforce any other decision on Israelis. Also, he says, for better or for worse, the two-state solution is supported by the UN and is popular at international level as well. And then there are those who just want to see peace in the region and don't have a strong opinion on how to go about it. Salim Mukhtar Siddiqui is one of those commenters. He says peaceful coexistence with respect for each other's rights and recognition of each other is the way to go. Let's also hear what some commenters on the streets of Islamabad had to say about the two-state solution.
Ultimately, that is a better solution, because if Palestine and Israel get into two separate states, then they can live their own lives happily, I guess. Because until and unless if it's not happens, then Israel will, keep oppressing Palestine people.
There should be two separate states. They have ideological differences. They cannot survive together.
So there you have it. Based on political and religious views, people have differing opinions on what's the best way to bring peace in the region. But the fact is that everybody does want to see peace. Back to you, Aisha.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Mr. Shahade, I'll come to you. So, two-state solution, UN agrees with it, US agrees with it, even Israelis and Palestinians agree with it, but it seems a long way off. What are some of the things that both sides will have to compromise to get to it?
Well, I think the two-state solution is the only solution, and we're very close to it. I mean, the Palestinians have received recognition on the General Assembly level of about 140 countries. The only thing standing in the way is a US veto, because the Israelis will not accept it. Moving straight to a two-state solution would be a good idea. Then you'd have two states that have problems, two neighboring countries that have issues to resolve, and which two neighboring countries don't? I mean, the Oslo formula can be re-examined, and it's a good time to re-examine it. Lack of leadership is not necessarily such a bad thing, as Emanuele was saying. The leaders of the region did not have control over their population. What they did was they used the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in order to control their population, and that's a big difference. They legitimized themselves. They called the
so basically you're
state
saying
of emergency
the
in these
Oslo
countries.
formula. Let's come to the Oslo formula. You think it's a good time to think about the Oslo formula, as he's suggesting?
Well, the Oslo formula was basically a mechanism to get from point A, the post-1967 status quo, to point B, a two-state solution. A lot of things happened along the way that made it complicated and difficult to work out. I don't think that the formula in and of itself was the problem. Of course, you try and you fail, and then people make mistakes, and factors play into these failures. But the bottom line is that today, it's hard to speak about the two-state solution, not just because the gap between the two sides is still significant, but also because the divisions within the Palestinian camp are huge. I mean, we should actually start talking about the three-state solution, maybe. How are you going Gaza versus the West Bank? Actually,
so
if you look,
Hamas as the third
you have
state?
a situation where in the West Bank you have a nominal authority that is recognized by most of the world as a state that is not really a state. And in Gaza you have an actual government that nobody recognizes, but is functioning as a mini-state.
Okay, hold on. Let me come to you, Mr. Shahade. A three-state solution, and that's what I said before. We don't have Hamas on the table. How are we going to move forward?
Well, you do have Hamas on the table indirectly, because the balance between Hamas and Fatah creates a Palestinian position. Fatah cannot make an agreement without taking Hamas into consideration, without taking the Palestinians abroad into consideration. So in a way, the rejectionists are strengthening the Fatah hand, because Fatah cannot make a compromise without taking their very significant view.
You're basically saying they may not be sitting with Hamas, and we've seen they have immense differences. I mean, they're fighting amongst each other, but in this one case, they're taking Hamas on board.
Well, I see it as basically very similar to the difference between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, except that they're not under occupation. I mean, we have to take this into consideration. The Palestinians are under occupation. They've gone through a lot, and they are divided. Division is not an unhealthy matter. There's no society in the world that doesn't have political divisions.
Okay,
but
let
me
throw something else out there. You mentioned a three-state solution. Some people are saying if the status quo continues, there may be a one-state solution, not because everybody agrees on it, but because that will be forced by the demographics of the region. What do you think?
Well, what I think is that there are two obstacles to such a solution ever coming to fruition. The first is that if you move out of the intellectual discourse of mostly Western-based liberal and Arab intellectuals, Palestinians overwhelmingly want their own state. They don't want to live together with the Israelis in a happy one community. They want to have their own
state. But we've seen the last 20 years no progress. If there's no progress for another 20 years, there may not be a two-state solution
Possible,
viable.
but the bottom line is that by and large they still want to have their own state. That's one thing. The second thing is that when you have such a history of animosity and conflict between two ethnic communities, putting them together usually is not a successful way forward. It could actually create the conditions for one state that disintegrates into civil war, and then we're back to square one. I think that given the experience of over 100 years of mutual hatred and conflict, the best way forward is to separate them into two political entities that have good neighborly relations of some sort, but they are separate. And they set their own destiny.
So let's see how we can get there. Both sides, if they're at the table and are talking, will have to give up something. Let's ask Mr. Shahade, what do you think is each side most willing to give up?
Well, I mean, I come from a one-state solution. I come from Lebanon, and I don't recommend it. So, a two-state solution, but not the way Emmanuel is describing it. It's not. It will never be two totally separate states with one is purely Jewish and one is purely Arab, because there are Arabs living in Israel, and there will always be Jews living in Palestine. And so it's. But sovereignty, we have to compromise on our understandings of sovereignty, and it will be a two-state solution where, in a situation where there is peace, there is nothing that prevents refugees going to live in Israel. There's nothing that prevents
You mean the right of return, but that will change Israel's Jewish character, which is the one thing that they want.
Well, I don't think it would, because if some refugees live in Israel and have a Palestinian citizenship, they will be Palestinian citizens living in Israel.
So just to live
some settlers
not as
could
citizens.
be in.
Let me quickly come to you, Dr. Ottolenghi. Living in Israel, but not as citizens of Palestine.
It's an interesting thought. It's like imagining that you could get to the point where German citizens are living in France and England within the context of the European Union and vice versa. It can happen in the Middle East too, but Europe took several hundred years, 2 world wars, a few 100 million people killed in the course of religious wars, ethnic wars, national conflicts. So I doubt that in the short term this is going to be possible.
Let's find out what the people think about it. Sarah, what are people saying about what each side must give up?
Aisha, when we asked our commenters what demands they think the Israelis and Palestinians should be willing to compromise on in the interest of peace, the general opinion was that Israelis should be the one showing flexibility. Farhad Khan Sodozai asks, what issues should the Palestinians compromise on? Israel should step back as it's the one occupying Palestinian territories. And Shamaila Said also thinks that the key to the success of this dialogue is going to be in Israel's hands. She says Israel is the occupier while Palestinians have been subjugated for too long. Why should they give up even an inch in their legitimate cause? On the other hand, commenters like Shoaib Durrani think that if Israel softens up a little on border issues, this could benefit it. And he also says those engaged in armed resistance for Palestinian independence should also be more open to talks. Our video commenters from Pakistan, however, highlighted some more specific issues that they would like to see the parties involved work on. Let's hear what those are.
So we need to look at the, greater cause, what's taking them away from the deal. I think there are too many actors playing right now.
As long as they give Jerusalem back to Palestine where it really belongs, other than that, I'm fine with everything.
Now, while there is more support for Palestinian demands among our commenters, many people are not clear on what exactly it is that Israel and even Palestinians are demanding when they sit at the negotiation table this time. And we want to hear your thoughts on this issue. Post your comments on facebook.com/accesspointwithat or log on to our Urdu VOA's Facebook page. That's all from the social media desk. Back to you, Aisha.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And as we heard, a lot of people around the world are not even sure what each side wants. I mean, so I'll very quickly come to you, Mr. Shahade, and then go to Dr. Ottolenghi. What is it that each side wants? Give me a very brief description.
Well, if you add what each side wants, they both want the same thing, and it's a zero-sum game, and they can't both have it. They both want the whole of Palestine, and they have there is a sort of a symmetrical concept of justice. The Palestinians want a Palestinian state to protect them because everybody in the region doesn't like them, and they want a right of return. And the Zionist idea is based on also a state protecting the Jews and the right of return to that country,
as you said, is never going to happen because both cannot have it all. So what does each side want? Just break it down for us very quickly.
Well, they both want a national state.
Okay.
They, of course, have a territorial claim, at least in principle, over the entire territory that it is in dispute, the one that was created by the League of Nations after World War I and the Mandate for Palestine.
You both of you, please correct me if I'm wrong, but in the interest of time, may I be overly simplistic and just name a few things? Would it be fair to say that at this time for negotiations to succeed, the Palestinians want a nation state based on the 1967 borders, and the Israelis want a safe state with
territorial adjustments.
Territorial adjustments and neighbors who do not, and security guarantees. Would that be fair, Mr. Shahade, in very simplified terms?
In the interest of time, the two stumbling points are the right of return and a very small area in the old city of Jerusalem, which is the esplanade of the Aqsa. And both have intangible consequences that need compromises and special language on both sides.
And why shouldn't we make East Jerusalem an international city or state like the Vatican, or give joint, both sides handle it jointly? I know it's a very sensitive area. I know there are three big religions of the world that are fighting there. So again, I'm oversimplifying it, but why not?
Because first and foremost, the two sides are not happy with it. It's second best or third best choice, if you wish, to have a power sharing arrangement. If they could have it, they would have it for themselves.
Yes, but they've been fighting for how many years now? Mr. Shahade, do you think any chance that East Jerusalem or all of Jerusalem becomes a joint territory?
Well, technically there's already a UN General Assembly resolution from 1948 which declares Jerusalem as an international city in a sense, like the Vatican. So it is possible, but this is not really the issue. I mean, what Emanuele said before is very true. There's been so much work on this. There are detailed work on access points, on governance issues in Jerusalem. It's not a problem. The main problem is the intangible issue of the esplanade and
who handles the holy sites.
Even who handles the holy site is not an issue. There are waqfs in Jerusalem that handle the holy sites for the Christians and all that. But it's a question of an intangible sovereignty, I would say.
And that's a term that's so difficult to define. So let me ask you. We're coming towards the end. Do you see any hope this time around?
You know, it's a bit like doing an experiment in a laboratory, and the experiment fails and you keep repeating it with the same ingredients. I find it hard to believe that the result will be different.
Do you think Kerry has a whip out this time? I mean, he really had an intense diplomacy bringing him to the table. It's like, stay there until you...
Neither side wants to say no to the United States. Both sides need things from the United States. And so both sides have come to speak to each other. Whether they actually find an agreement as a result of this, it's hard to say.
It's hard to say, and as I said, it looks so much like the rerun of a movie. We will probably be talking about this again in a couple of months, but for now the time is up. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Emanuele Ottolenghi, who's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Nadeem Shahade, who's an associate fellow of Chatham House Middle East and North Africa program. And thank you for watching. Until next time. Goodbye.